At any rate, I also want to say, as I said for Rotary today at lunch, that it's always good to come for Veterans Day, that if there are any veterans here, I do honor your sacrifices and your service. I also have a personal touch to Veterans Day. My older son was born on the 11th of November. We called my mother to say it was a boy because we hadn't actually tried to find out ahead of time, and she said, "Oh, too bad. If it had been a girl, you could have named him, Armista." I bet you never heard, yeah, Aunt Sudie never told Margaret that, I think. So let's make sure we understand what's a baby boomer. So Tammy started us out, and she said essentially that 1946, when the veterans come home, you began to see a surge in births, and that it lasts rather mysteriously, in some ways, until about 1964. Now, in my research, I have begun to count that. And so I have gone to the county records, to the birth certificates, and I have counted A's so far. And you know what? It comes out exactly what Tammy said. So let me just kind of give you a sense of the numbers just for people named A. By the way, I do plan to do S's when I have about a week just to count Sigmunds. So, and if I add Setzers, the book may be delayed a year. So, at any rate, it works out perfectly. So in the A category, all through the Great Depression, there are approximately 25 to 30 births with names that start with A. It's consistent for 20 years. From the late 20s to the mid 40s, you get up to about 33. 1947 comes, not 1946. We seem to have a little bit of a delay. It jumps to 67. Now that's a small number still, but it's double what the average has been for 20 years. So that's your perfect boom. It stays at approximately 50-something, and then you have a blip for the Korean War. And also what is in real case the recession that also kind of accompanied it for a short time. And it goes back down to the 30s for 1 year. I think it's 51. It then comes back by 53, and it stays in the 50s or the 60s. So you might have 58, you might have 57. You never, I think, get above 61, something in that vicinity, until 1961, and then it begins to drop. And it goes back to the 40s, and it stays in the 40s through the 70s. You have a couple of years it goes up to the 50s. Now I want to remind everyone that that is a little bit of a disingenuous number, because there are more people living in the county in the 1970s by far than the 1950s. I haven't figured out how to fudge that yet, because we only take the census every 10 years. So if you take 40 to 45, say in the 70s, that's really the same rate as the 1930s, I think, if you had your numbers to do it. So we had the baby boomers work out. What I'm gonna do is sample other letters. I probably will do S, and I'll probably do something like M. I could get really quirky and do Q, but I doubt I have many to count. But I will have a graph that will show this. The point, however, is that Catawba County followed the national norm. The births went up exactly when they should have, and they began to decline exactly when they should have. And what I'm also finding is that the changes in perception, in expectation, and in what I would call social cohesion come about in the newspapers exactly on schedule. Now, what do I mean? Well, what I would be doing if I was teaching this to you in my history class is I would be describing what I call the rise of the counterculture that begins about 1963, 64, and 65, and then picks up steam in the late 1960s. And I'm not even to the hippies yet. I'm just simply talking about the great changes. The great changes. Now do the math. So if you're born in 1947, when do you go to the first grade? 53, maybe 52, right? somewhere in there. When do you get your car or your driver's license? Age 16. It's about 1963. The very first Catawba County baby boomers began to come of age to drive about 1963. And one of the great changes nationwide is that you are in the process of going from a car per family, who knows the rest, to a car per person. And that seems to occur in our nation in about a 7-year period. Well, that's hard to measure in one place. Like, I don't have all the dealership records, and all that kind of stuff. I could look at license taxes, etc. But I found an article, and right when it should say in 1965, Paul Fogelman, who was one of the great reporters in the Hickory Daily Record, talks about how Hickory has become car crazy, and everyone is buying a car. And what he meant by that was that he was essentially comparing how many cars he remembered from the 50s when he was at Lenore-Rhine to what he was seeing around 64 and 65. And so I'm going to assume, without proving it yet, that my pattern holds. What are the other things I teach my students? Well, who comes of age at age 16 and 17? Boys and girls. And the girls who come of age in 63, 64, roughly, they do two new things that they're more likely to do than their mothers did. Anybody want to guess what they are? Go to work. What's the second one? Huh? No, well, I'll call that the same. Go to college. That's true. No, take a pill. Yep. Take the pill. In other words, what is astonishing is the convergence of more women working and more women at least publicly, seeking contraception. Well, I don't have that. There is no magical article in any of our papers about women take the pill. They went out on the streets of Union Square and asked them. This didn't happen, and I don't have that data. So I can't tell you that Catawba County had that change. So I can't say. I don't know precisely. But by 1966, both O&E and the Daily Record talk about something they consider to be phenomenal: women working on the assembly lines in furniture factories. Now, in truth, in Catawba County, women had always worked in factories, particularly the hosiery mills. And so if I went and measured it, I'd already have the data skewed, wouldn't I? Because in theory, if you have 100 hosiery mills in this county in the 60s, as we did, you've already skewed the data, haven't you? Women are going to be more likely to be working in this county than in the proverbial, say, Dick Van Dyke suburb. You see? And so I can't measure that either. But what does the paper suddenly start saying? Both papers, they find women doing things outside of the house. And then I found what I just was so excited. It was just wonderful. It was like you had set up the design and the design worked in science. It's amazing. Women suddenly acquire first names. Yeah, they aren't Mrs. Whoever, right? They are suddenly Sylvia Kid Ray as opposed to, Mrs. Ralph Ray, et cetera, although Sylvia always had her name, but she was a pioneer in naming. So at any rate, the point essentially is, if you look closely at my little microcosm of America, and I fudge it a little bit, all the trends I teach are happening, you see? Now, the one that I'm actually proudest of in retrospect is the next thing you would say in this lecture is you would tell your students, well, these kids came of age and what did they take their parents didn't take? Different kinds of drugs. Now, I always say to them different kinds because then you go into the standard explanation, well, Mom, she was stoned out of her mind on Valium because she really couldn't handle the suburban life and she was tired of the reruns of I've Got a Secret and, et cetera, et cetera. But in Catawba County, you do not see the trend to pot, which of course is the drug that occurs first, until about 68, 69. And there is an article that says very clearly that it did not penetrate Hickory High. I have not yet seen anything for any other high schools until about 1970. But that follows exactly my experience, we will not go into details, and Margaret, hold your ears, across the river in Iredell County. So the patterns are holding. The patterns are holding very well, which allows me to both explain things that Catawbans are Americans like everyone else, and what the baby boomers are here, they are everywhere else. But just like everywhere else, it's still a mystery. Let me explain. No scholar has ever adequately explained what happened in the mid-60s. All the things that occur and the differences in appearance between, say, a graduate in high school in 1961 and one in 1969 has been written about, made movies about, everything has been talked about, but there's no total explanation for what is essentially an explosion. What an explosion? Well, there was an explosion of anger. There was the explosion of anticipation, whatever that means. Some scholars argue that there was an explosion of expectation, that the way you explain baby boomers is that they believed something was going to happen, and then what? It didn't happen, and they were mad. The other explanation takes a more conservative view. They were spoiled brats. If they had just lived up to the standards of their parents and grandparents, this all would have never happened. I love to tell people like that. Then I say, you know what I say to them? I say, oh, that means Reagan would have never been elected. And they immediately change their story. You see? And it is the expectation thesis. There is also, and this one's very important for us here in Catawba County, the delayed career benefits thesis. There's an argument that nationwide, baby boomers came of age and they were the crowded generation. Too many of them wanted too many jobs at the same time. That doesn't apply here. The unemployment rate was 1.5% most of these years. Anyone could get any job, so to speak, at least the entry level. Am I not on?
Yeah, do you mind turning the mic on?
I don't mind at all. I'm so sorry.
Well,
What went on?
I didn't think you needed it.
Oh, is that better? No. Can you hear me, silly? Sorry, that was way too loud.
Maybe your other mic.
Is it both on?
I don't know. Is it not on?
Alex, help.
No, there's
Am I on?
you've got the ones in the camera, Scott.
Okay, so I need to use both and
Did you use both or no?
what should I do?
Can you
I'm
all hear
sorry.
it back?
There will be a commercial interruption.
Yeah, sorry about that. but
I am so sorry. I thought they could hear
Maybe,
me.
let me
Turn me down.
Okay, because in the back someone couldn't hear.
I'm so sorry. How's that? Is that better?
But it's got
Is the pitch? Well,
say.
yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Let me step back.
You've got a little box that goes with your microphone.
Right there.
It's on,
It's on.
but is it on channel A?
Maybe that's the problem.
Check.
So we don't turn that on?
He's on A too, Alex. You're on A?
Okay, we just need to roll back on the tone and then stay off the mic itself, because that creates.
All right, how far away you want me to say?
Oh.
About like that?
You can use it that way.
About like that? How's that sound? Is that better? Sylvia, does that sound better? Okay, I won't misbehave, I hope. I'm back to the explosion. And the truth is, I've been to both Wake, I've been to Davidson, I've looked at every book I can find, and I can't find anything that explains this to my satisfaction. Because I thought, I'll come up with the thesis that helps Catawba fit into the model and everything. But it happened just like you expected, or at least I expected. Listen to the things that suddenly appear in the newspapers, okay? This is all 1965 and 1966, and I need to take my glasses off. Now you need to remember that it isn't poverty. In Catawba County, the average family income increased 78% during the decade. That accounts for inflation. So if you're immediately going to tell me about the price rise, I've already fixed that. Even with some other estimates, the lowest that gets is 67%. And in fact, the paper talks about this. Both papers talk about how suddenly working class people are making more and able to have more. That's a very important point, I think. Only 15% of Catawbans were farming in the 1960s. They were a little more visible because when you rode through the countryside, it did seem like there were more of them. But what that doesn't account for is that 90% of the growth in this county was in the 1950s and the 60s was in a wedge from Viewmont to Oxford to Conover. 90% of the growth was in that wedge. Hickory, despite its every effort to fudge the census numbers, actually lost population. Conover gained, Newton stayed about the same. The county kind of gets lost in that in certain ways. So you can't use the theory that there's this gap, there's this lag, something's not going right. But what are the things I found? Well, almost immediately, for example, fast food arrives. Hardee's, a convenience store arrives. Handy pantry, remember the handy pantries? The first notion of computers, I find. The county goes to a payroll that's computerized. The First National Bank in Hickory goes to a computer center, mostly for accounts. Of course, WHKY gets its television station. I don't assume anybody's watching it, but that's another story. At least I don't know. I got it back then. I remember finding that. And of course, many of you will remember that it's about the mid-60s that color television comes in, for at least most people around here, and that pans out if you go look for the ads. Sears, etc., they will suddenly be selling the color TVs, and I've checked that out. I've already told you about women getting first names, and I think the most fascinating statistic I've found is Citizen Savings and Loan here. I think First Federal had a similar thing. We're handing out, meaning closing, on 3 mortgages a day during the 1960s, at least the mid-1960s. So people were able to buy a house, they were able to do this. And your other number, and I think it was Tammy who said college, the Hickory paper also publishes the fact that for all 3 school systems, in 1967, I think that's what my notes say, for the first time a majority of our students went to college. It's unclear to me if that counts the community college. That wasn't made clear to me, so it could involve that as well. But what you had was an explosion of things. And it's just unexplainable. And I haven't seen it before. So let me use the examples. All this is within an 18-month period, middle of the decades. A young boy takes a Molotov cocktail and attempts to burn down St. Stephen's Elementary School. Throws it through the window. The fire department gets there and saves it. Someone slashes all the portraits of the judges in the courtroom. Does the vandalism to them. And my absolute favorite, on Easter Monday of 1966, a young man from Sandy Ford area walks into Hickory with his shotgun and blows the windows out of the Hickory Police Department. There is no evident motive. By the way, no one was hurt. But the Hickory police got in the paper holding it like it was John Dillinger's gun. You know, like they had stopped a crime wave in Chicago. And when they built the Villa Park shopping center, somebody attempted to burn it down before it opened. Now, those are 4 of the most salient examples, but what I was struck by was the extent to which it all came at the same time. It all does seem to be correlated to young people, although the data is a little mixed. It does not have a racial dynamic that I can find. In other words, I can't say there's anything patterned like that. There were also racial issues, that's another story. And it doesn't last. So by 1969, these episodes are gone, but they're replaced by what many of you will remember as the Great Crime Wave, when it was unsafe to be in a convenience store, when service stations were robbed, when people were actually broken into in their houses, etc. And that crime wave seems to be correlated with the beginnings of the drug problems and the paying for the drugs, and does perhaps, although I'm not going to investigate it, have a racial dynamic. But this 1965 explosion seems to have nothing. It just seems to suddenly be. It became dangerous to be out at Halloween, not only for mailboxes, but they overturned a Hickory police car. They put toilets in front of the general store at Terrell. And the gentleman who ran a store at Bandy's waited for them one night, and when they got out of the car, giggling and laughing, he showed them how he could fire straight up in the air with his shotgun, and they seem to have left their waste products behind as they left. I thought that was a true Catawban story. Wasn't going to hurt anybody, but you're going to scare them a little bit, you know? So where are we left? What do I say? What is it that's going on in a county where there weren't economic issues like Watts, where there were racial issues, but not the same sort of racial issues that you found in all the urban ghettos, and where essentially it seemed as if the American dream was alive and well for people coming of age? Now you're left with one answer. What is it? I've left it out so far. 1965 is also the beginnings of the escalation of the Vietnam War. And I can't find a direct connection. Nobody else has ever quite done it. That's always your default. Oh, they're scared, they're going to Vietnam. They're mad, they're going to Vietnam. It's unfair, they're going to Vietnam. But I can't find that. Now, I will tell you, I am patterning the Vietnam victims. In other words, I am taking those who died, and I'm looking for the geographic pattern within the county. My preliminary is, and you might be proud of this if you're a traditionalist, is that 9 out of 10 of them have a church. So when it said who they were, they had a family, they had a high school, and they had a congregation. And I think that is a very interesting tribute in terms of tradition. There doesn't seem to be a class issue either for Catawbans who at least died in the war. They seem to come from a cross-section, everyone from the pastor to a Lenore Ryan professor to various people of various professions up and down the scale. I will next month be interviewing some Vietnam vets, all from Bandy's high school, that I met on reunion day. And I will tell you, especially on Veterans Day, I had 2 of them cry. It almost made me cry because they said, well, no one's ever asked us. So I plan to ask. And I plan to ask on your behalf as well as mine, because I think their stories should be at least listened to, depending on what I do. So what happens to these guys? Well, they go to college. Tammy's right. You're going to find more and more people there. They go to high school, but the high schools become disruptive. I'm only beginning to analyze that in any kind of assertiveness. Hickory High has off and on 10 years of confrontations over various issues. The data is very weak for everyone else. I have bits of this, bits of that. I have talked to people who went to Catawba Rosenwald, but I haven't yet talked to them about integration. I've talked to them about their previous lives. I'll be working on that. So we have racial issues with baby boomers, and many of them, and what could be distinctive to us, and again, I don't know how to do it, I don't know how to compare it, is the real factor for this college that the violence and the anger dissipated a little faster? Is it Bob Papp and the Technical Institute? So I can't tell you I'm right, but if you add up some of the elements, the fact that he came here from somewhere else, and he had a more, we'll call it democratic with a little d agenda, which meant that his attitude was that every person who walked in the front door of that building was equal in the eyes of those who educated him or her, black or white, poor or not. And that he was dedicated to the fact that he would set up a curriculum for whatever was needed as fast as possible. And one of the distinctions seems to have been that he did that faster than other places. I'm still not 100% sure of that, but I think that's true. And that could mean that if the thesis is professional frustration, what am I going to do? There's too many of us, we're all looking for jobs. You knew you had a leg up if you trained in furniture technology or furniture management or the secretarial school, etc., which was far cheaper than what you paid for that 1 year at Lenore Ryan, see, which didn't please Lenore Ryan for a while. And all of these things could have been what made the difference. I still don't know. I'm still working on it. Now, what happened to these folks? Well, you know the rest of the story. They got jobs. They went through harder times in the 1970s. They had their own babies, started their own families, and many of them, particularly in Catawba County, voted for Ronald Reagan. In other words, they didn't follow the particular model of radicalism. They followed more the traditional model of the two-party system that veered towards a Republican majority. But as best I can tell in looking at the vote totals, and I am doing this through time, that is a very gradual process. And I still haven't quite concluded what I think I want to know. But it is very clear that in the end, the majority of the people who came of age and stayed in this county continued to have the traditional values that the county had always had. Industrialism, a sense of family. Certainly there is an element of the persistence of a culture from Balls Creek to what Baptist churches do, etc., and the monolith of Lutheranism that's still there, all those things. All those things seem to be there. And so I'm left with a real problem, and that is the national literature has me think of one thing, but Catawba in some ways makes me question that. And I still haven't quite got it straight. So I'll stop at this point, let you ask any questions, go in any direction you want, and help me. First, I need to know the choir. Other than Tammy and me, who are the baby boomers? All right, so did I explain you at all? Did this help at all? Tammy, you want to start?
I don't know if this has any relevance at all.
Yeah, it's me leaning. That's what it is. What'd I do? Hit the
mentioned this violence in the middle of the 60s.
Yes.
I wonder if it has to do with two things. I'm just throwing two ideas out.
Go for it.
I'm going to tack back to where I come from in the middle of the Midwest. Did it have anything to do with media and people seeing violence on the news or whatever? And
I can answer that one.
Was it any way related to Kennedy's assassination? Because you haven't mentioned
I can answer that too.
And the third thing I want to say is when you mentioned someone trying to burn something down, I grew up in a small town in the middle of a cornfield in Illinois, and in '63 there was a guy trying to burn the town down. But I think he was a policeman.
See, Southerners are always behind the curve. What
Well,
do you-
I'm going to say, we were like a year ahead. But it was the same kind of deal, a small town, and somebody's trying to create mayhem. I don't know.
Well, the mayhem is what fascinates me because I really didn't expect that much. I didn't really expect a kid to throw a Molotov cocktail into St. Stephen's Elementary School. I mean, in 1965. That just fascinated me. And I left out the girl who stole the school bus in Maiden. Okay? Let me do Kennedy. How do you measure that? I don't know. It clearly had impact. It's in the papers. We talk about it. I found a great picture in Stanley Stiver's scrapbooks in Claremont of a tribute to Kennedy in Claremont. It's really cool. And the thing about violence, let me give you what's now called the 28.5-minute explanation. Baby boomers got their consciousness watching television in the 50s and 60s. We all agree that there was a significance to that consciousness. And I know, Martin, you're right with the hand, but play with me a minute here, okay? What was the show always about? There are only 3 shows. One was the old vaudeville, Ed Sullivan, right? And his imitators. And they were just entertainment. They were distraction, weren't they? Toto Dijo, or whatever it was, Good Night Eddie and all that, all right? What was the second show? Shoot 'em up westerns. Who were they killing? Russians. Russians wore black hats. Most people interpret the westerns partly for the American frontier spirit, but also secondly, it's a Cold War thing, okay? Bear with me on that one. What's the third one? All of you should know. It's the most popular type of television media back then. Father Knows Best, Leave It to Beaver, Andy. Did you ever notice what's missing in all those shows? In most cases, mom. Or at least a significant mom, right? And What always happens? Beaver screws up. My favorite is the cartoon that made fun of this in the 80s. Ward came home. June said, "Ward, the beaver blew up the Dairy Queen today." What does Ward say? "I'll have a talk with him, dear." I love that cartoon. That could be the best explanation of all. Because what would Ward's grandfather have done?
Woodshed.
Woodshed. And Ward maybe pulled out his version of psychology today. So one of the ways in which you get at this, but I don't know how you get at it for a small sampling that is a county, because I don't know how I measure that, given what we're doing, is the expectation first, at the end of every 28 and a half minutes, Daddy will fix it. Andy knows best. Same thing, Andy's just the redneck version of Father Knows Best, right? He just has a lot of children, Barney, Goober, Floyd, right? Okay? And if you grew up with that expectation, that's a different expectation than your parents who grew up in the Great Depression and listened to radio shows where you were Flash Gordon and you got to go to space and forget about how hard it was. And one of the theses that people bring forth on the baby boomers is that they call it the never again thesis. Does anybody know that one? Well, I had to work like this and I had to go into the factory and my goodness, what? My children won't. And I was a victim of that, although you could say I was lucky because I didn't have to get up and milk cows at 4:30 in the morning with Uncle Jim. Sometimes I still wish they had made me, but I'm sure at that time I wouldn't have liked it, right? They didn't do that to me. That's probably what's wrong with me. Margaret can't talk. At any rate, if you don't know, this is my cousin Margaret. At any rate, that's also one of the theses. So what did you do? You consolidated schools, right? In the 50s, right? See, think about it. One of the things I'll say in the book is your schools are still the core from the 50s. Fred T. Ford is still Fred T. Ford. Bandy's is still Bandy's, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Have you ever thought about all your prominent churches are still the core of the 50s? Corinth, Grace here, Trinity in Conover, on and on and on. And do you realize how few of them, except with additions, weren't changed for 30 years? And there was an institutional infrastructure set up in the 50s, and the baby boomers went through it. What was different? Well, as I found by looking at the Bandy's annuals, they had to completely reorient their community. They were rootless. They had to reroute. And what we can't quite measure is how rooted do they become. I don't know the answer. I know it in Ridgeview. They actually talk about the ambivalence they feel about civil rights when they find out that what they wanted was equality and what they got was their neighborhood school was closed. And they didn't like it totally. They wanted to be treated differently at Hickory, but they didn't necessarily have moorings. But you see, I can't say that easily because that's not politically correct. As many of you know, I'm not politically correct, but that's another story. But is it that they didn't have an anchor? That was the old anchor. And that could be part of it. But how would I tell it for us? Where's my evidence for that? I'm still searching. So all of these things, and I will be a polite person and say, it's what John Stewart would call a cluster something, and you have to watch the show to know what I'm talking about, and that could simply be what happened. It all converged when they came of age. And the great change was they all had cars.
Could the fact that there were more latchkey kids
Yes.
have a lot to do with it?
And again, I don't know how I measure it. Yeah. But here again, in Catawba, you had all these ladies with hosiery mill work. So is it true, is it not? I don't know.
Because nobody was home. They lived in, if parents were gone, they didn't have farm work to do.
Right.
Chores.
Bingo.
They didn't have a structure after
All right.
those free hours.
You win the Cupid doll. What would you have won in 1965? Whatever. You get a deferment for Vietnam. What would you say if I said this? I'm gonna be an anthropologist. What was the difference between baby boomers and their grandparents in many places in America? Their grandparents grew up on the farm, and the chores were constant. Even if the life was okay, let's not even assume overwork or poverty, but the chores were constant, and you didn't have as much time to do your mischief. And if you did do mischief, what?
Woodshed.
Yeah, we'll use the woodshed metaphor, okay? Right. What changed? A new society emerged that didn't know what to do to keep their kids corralled because the old ways were impossible and the new ways hadn't been sorted out. By the way, if I'm right, the result of all this is homeschooling. In a way. Because if you keep your kids at home to school them, you also what? Know where they are all the time. Right? What did farm families do? They attempted to keep their kids in this kind of corral. And even within Margaret and my family, what happened to all the urban cousins for a whole generation? Every summer they got sent to the farm because that would be good for them. Sadly, many of them, it didn't matter in my family, but that's another, it's not Margaret's side of the family, it's the other one. But essentially, maybe that is the real theory nationwide. If that's true, Catawba County proves it. Let me just give you the one thing that was the most shocking thing I've found. I mean, it's not a bad shock, just I had no idea. When Bandy's High School opened in 1954 and 1955, not a boy in that school knew the rules of football. Is that not amazing? They knew what football was, they knew you threw the ball, but they wrote an article about the fact that the coaches had to teach the boys the rules in order to play the game. And my suspicion is Bunker Hill wasn't that different. Fred T. Ford might not have been. Football had been an urban game in the factories, but farm boys played basketball and baseball. And the basketball tournament for Catawba County was the rural identity. You see, winter, you had stoves, you could stay warm, crowd together, girls played. I mean, you know, everything, it had everything. And you went to football games and where? Newton and Hickory. You see? All the rules change. And I'm not sure they knew what to do. And maybe we're too harsh in that way. Maybe it simply needed 20 years of shakedown to come up with whatever the new rules are. Daycare, kindergarten for everyone, homeschooling as choices. I don't know. I'm still working on that. That's called part 3. That's what I'm working on right now. So, who else? Anyone?